And we are back with another episode with Photoshop CC, the complete guide. We're in week 4, so we're really getting close to the end here. And today, well, tomorrow's our last day. We're one day away from wrapping it up. I know, we've been together for almost a whole month. Oh, they're getting teary in the audience here. Today, we're going to cover actions and automation. So if there's something we need to do all the time, or something we don't want to have to remember the steps for, or something similar to that, we're going to learn how to do it in Photoshop. So let's head over to Photoshop. All right. There are certain things that I need to do a lot. And some of them might be pretty simple techniques I need to do, but if it's more than one step, if it's like 3 steps to get it done, I might want to automate it if I do it often enough. If it's something I do 10 times a day, it's probably worth automating. So that's what we're going to start off with as far as an example goes. When I used this image, I believe we were talking about advanced retouching. And what we had done is I came in here and selected these little white marks. And I think I might have used the magic wand tool to come in here and just click on a few of these little spots. I held shift and I clicked on them and I got them selected. And then to get rid of them, I needed to go to the select menu and choose modify, and there was a choice called expand at some point and do other things. Well, there was one thing I attempted to do that didn't work. I don't know if you recall it or not. Let me get to the point where I was at. I had selected all these. I went to the select menu. I chose similar to have it find similar areas within the image. There it did. Then I came over here and chose expand. I expanded by about 2 pixels. And right here is when it started to become hard for me. And here's what I wanted to do, and it wouldn't let me. I created a brand new empty layer. I wanted to go over here and choose fill and tell it to use the content aware setting. When I did, it almost always says this if I'm working on an empty layer. And I was like, okay, fine, you're going to make me do more work. So I was like, I know I can get the end result I want, but I'm going to have to do a couple steps right now to get there. And here's what I did. I duplicated the layer that contained the original. I attempted to do what I was trying to do in the first place, again, by going to the Edit menu and choosing Fill. And when I was done, I did something as simple as going to the Select menu and choosing Inverse and hitting Delete. I don't know if you recall that or not, but I want to automate that process. So here I'm just testing it first to make sure I remember the process. Now I'll hit Delete. And once I've done that, over here in my layers palette was the actual result that I was looking for in the first place. But I hate that every time I try to use that feature where I go to the Edit menu and I choose Fill, I use the content aware setting that it doesn't want to work on an empty layer. And every time I have to duplicate the layer and go through this process, I curse. It's like I'm just saying, Adobe, why don't you, make this work? And so I make it work by using the features that are built into Photoshop. So let's see what I'm going to end up doing. We're going to record an action to make it easier. So the only steps that I don't mind, or that I do mind doing here, is creating a new layer, trying to use the feature, and realizing it doesn't work. So let's replace that with an action. I'm going to go to the Window menu. I'm going to choose Actions, and this comes up. And in here, we're just going to have a folder called Default Actions. And there might be some fun ones to play with in there, but we're going to make our own. At the bottom of the Actions panel is a folder icon. I'm going to create a brand new folder, and I'm going to call this CLPSD Bootcamp, because PSD stands for Photoshop. It's the file extension for a Photoshop file, and those are all the actions we'll make during this bootcamp. we'll just store them in there. So usually I have a bunch of folders in here. I might have ones called retouching actions and other ones called color adjustment actions and so on. So let's record one. An action is simply going to remember what I do to my picture so it can do it over again. And at the bottom of the actions panel, I'm going to click on this little icon. Usually there's two different icons we'll be working with. One is the record button, and we'll be using that if we're already recording an action and we pause it, we want to start recording again. That's going to be turned on here in just a moment. But to actually get it started, we're going to click this icon because we need to give our action a name. And I'm going to call this Content Aware Fill on Empty Layer. And it asked me what folder I'd like to put it in. Of course, it calls those folders a set, but it looks like a folder. It's got the icon of a folder. But that just makes sure I'm going to put it where I expect it to be. It's not going to be in with the defaults. It's in that new one we created. The stuff down below, we don't have to specify. If you want to put a color on it, you're welcome to. Then within the list, it can show up as a color. Some people like to organize their actions based on color. But when I click the record button, now notice that that icon I was pointing out before, it's pushed in. And that means I have to be very careful with what I do right now, because everything I do that has the potential of changing my image is going to be recorded. Now, there are some things that simply will not be recorded, and those are the things that don't have the potential of changing the look of my image. So right now, if I were to zoom in or zoom out of my picture like this, that's not being recorded because it doesn't affect the actual end result you get when you save the image. And therefore, it thinks it should be ignored. But anything that has the potential of changing it will. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag the background layer to the new layer icon. And when I do, watch in the layers panel. Duplicate current layer. That's what it's going to tell me. So it just recorded that step. Then I'm going to go to the edit menu and choose fill. And I'm going to make sure it's set to content aware. And I'm going to click OK. And when I do, watch the actions panel. It'll take a minute for it to finish. But once it's done, oh, and this is one thing, just so you know, if you're watching the video, I wouldn't try to follow along. I would watch the video till the end and then go back and try to follow along, because otherwise actions are easy to get off on as far as mentally where you're at compared to what I'm doing. So I would, in general, try to just watch it through, and on your second watch through, practice anything. But you see here it says fill. But in here, these look like relatively generic names. Fill, duplicate current layer. Do you see a little triangle next to some of those? You can click that triangle and expand it to see more detail. So this is just telling me it's recording the fill command, but this is the parts it is recording that we're using the setting called content aware, and these are the other settings set up in there. When I go to duplicate current layer, you click the triangle and there's nothing that shows up because there's no more detail needed other than duplicate current layer. Right? Okay, then after I was done filling, I went to the select menu and I selected inverse to get the opposite. And so when I choose that, we're going to get a new step called inverse. And then finally, I hit the delete key, which I'll do, and it does that. And to finish, I deselected. Then at the bottom of my actions panel, I'm going to hit the stop button. I can hit stop. Now I'm done with the action. Now it's no longer paying attention to what I'm doing. And sometimes you stop the action when you're not actually done, because there's something you need to do that you don't want to be recorded as part of the action. You need to go open a different picture, and you don't want it to open that different picture every time you run the action. Or who knows, maybe something happens in the middle and you mess up. Well, then you stop recording the action. You could drag one of these steps to the trash can to say, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I chose the wrong command. And then after throwing away that last step, you could hit the record button again. And now it's starting to pay attention again. It's going to add to your action. So that's one problem with actions, is let's say I did screw up. if I came in here and I painted on my picture and I went, oh man, I didn't mean to do that. Well, if I go to the Edit menu and choose Undo, Undo is not recorded in your action. An undo will not remove a step from your action. So that means you should practice whatever process you plan to record an action. Just make sure you practice it once right beforehand. That's why I did. So you remember the steps and you're not kind of experimenting while you're recording it. Because if you mess up, you'll have to hit the stop button to say stop recording what I'm doing. You'll have to grab that last step that you messed up on and drag it to the trash so it's no longer part of that action. Then you'll hit the record button again to continue on. And I really wish, and I've been begging Adobe for for over a decade, that when I choose undo, just put a step in my action called undo. But for some reason, they've chosen not to do that. And so it makes it so actions are more difficult to create than they should be. But I'm done with this action, so I'm going to hit the stop button. So now the next thing that I would do is test my action. Now, I'm going to use multiple undos to go back to whatever point I was at before I made my action. If you're not familiar with how to get multiple undos, when you go to the Edit menu, you have the standard undo. It only allows you to go back one step. And if you type it again, it simply reapplies what you've done. But if you use this one, it lets you go back multiple steps. All it does is it's the equivalent to opening a panel called the History panel and going back one step at a time. But it's the normal undo keyboard shortcut with the Option key added, or Alt in Windows. So to go back multiple steps, I'll do Option Command Z, and I'm going to go back until before that was filled in. Now I'm going to test my action to make sure it works, because who knows, maybe it messed up, or on occasion there'll be some weird feature in Photoshop where action just ignores the feature. It could be that at the time they added a feature, the person that's responsible for working on actions just didn't get in there and so, oh, we had this new feature I wasn't aware of, so he didn't incorporate its ability to be recorded, or there could be a technical reason why it's too difficult for it to be recorded as an action. So you got to watch the Actions panel as you create your action and just make sure that whatever you did that was important showed up in the action, and when you're done, you test it. So let's test it. I'm going to click on the name of our action, which is right here. And once you have your action, you can collapse it down with a little triangle to the left. That will collapse to not show the steps, or expand to show them. And I just click on the name, and at the bottom of my Actions panel, I have a play button. So I'm going to click the play button, and let's see if it works. This is a high-res image, and there's a whole bunch of those spots, so it takes it a while to do it. But I'm going to watch in my Layers panel when I'm done, and notice that, yep, it did work, because that's what I wanted. I wanted only the areas where it did the retouching to be on this layer, and I wanted the rest of the layer to be empty. As if I created a new layer before I went to the Edit menu and chose Fill, and it just worked without giving me that warning. And so now I have a replacement for that time when I have an area selected and I know I'm about to be annoyed when I try to create a new layer and fill it. Instead, I simply click on the name of this action and I hit the play button. And it does the work for me to give me the end result I want. So let's make a bunch of more actions. And in the process of making actions, we'll learn that my ideal end result is to make sure that my actions are compatible with almost any image I might use them on. It's very easy to make an action that won't work on some images. And so let's see how that might be the case. For instance, with this image, what I would like to do is make the image less colorful on the edges, out on the edges of the image. Okay? So let's first go through the steps, because usually I practice first. I'm going to use the Marquee tool to make a selection. And I'm just going to go a little bit inside from the corner of the image, and I'm going to drag down to about there. Then I want that selection to fade out, to have a soft edge on it. So I'll go to the Select menu and choose Select and Mask. And that's where we had a slider called Feather. And what's nice is I have a preview, so that's the only reason I'm in Select and Mask. There's so many settings in here, I don't need all those settings, I only need that one. Now, if you have an older version of Photoshop, remember Select and Mask is from the brand new version that was just announced. You would have a choice that's instead called Refine Edge. And you'd find the same slider called Selection, or it's called Feather. And you might not get the same preview I'm getting where it fades out like this, because you might have a different setting up here where we have previews. Most of the time I have it set to a red overlay. But the only thing that's important is I went in here and I moved the feather slider up so that this fades out. And the only reason I used that command instead of the one called select modify feather is there's a preview. Whereas the select modify feather is another way of feathering the edge, but there's no preview, so it's hard to figure out what number to type in. So anyway, I got this selected. Now that has the middle part of the image selected, and that's not the part I want to change. I want to change the outer edge. So I'll next go to the select menu and choose inverse. Then I'm going to create an adjustment layer. That adjustment layer is called hue and saturation, or I could use the one called vibrance. They both have sliders for saturation. Might as well use vibrance. And I could either bring the saturation slider down, or I could bring the vibrance slider down. Both of them will make the image less colorful. And those are the steps that I want to record as an action, because I don't want to have to do that all the time. It's going to make the edges of my image less colorful so that your attention will be drawn to the more colorful center of the image. So now let's go through that process and record it as an action and make sure that action is compatible with just about any image I might use. So I'll throw away the adjustment layer, and we're going to start all over again. I open my Actions panel. If you don't have your Actions panel open, you can go to the Window menu to find your actions. And I'm going to click on the icon to create a new action. And I'm going to call this Desaturate Photo Edge. Record. And now I got to be very careful because everything I do is being recorded. That's why it's nice to be practiced. I'm going to start with the selection tool. Again, I'll click this far in, make my selection. I'll go again to Select and Mask, which is called Refine Edge if you're in the old version. Click OK. Then I'm going to select Inverse. I'll then make my adjustment layer. I'm doing the exact same process. And actually, before I used, what was it, Vibrance? Here I happen, just out of habit, go to hue and saturation. And this is where if I messed up, that I might need to hit the stop button at the bottom of the action and throw that away. But in this case, it doesn't really matter because we do have a saturation slider, and it works just fine for what I want. I'll bring it down a good amount. Then when I'm done, that's all I want. Maybe I want to change the name of this layer because I might not know why it's there after being recorded. So I'll double click on its name and I'll just call this Desaturate Edges. Okay. Now let's go back to our actions and I'm going to hit the stop button. And let's inspect our action and see if there's anything we see within it that might make it not compatible with other pictures. First step is called Set Selection, which means make a selection. And if I expand it, ooh, I see something wrong in there. What if later on I open a document that is 30 inches wide and 30 inches tall? This is going to make a selection where the bottom right edge is like almost about 6 inches down and 9 inches to the right. So if I end up working with a larger picture later on, this is not going to make a selection that is centered on the middle of the picture. It's going to make a selection of the same size in inches as we used before. And you see how that would be an issue? What if I have an image that's only 4 inches wide when I apply it? It can't make a selection that big. It'll make a selection. It just will go all the way over to the edge of my picture. So I need to do something there. And so what I'm going to do is replace that first step. So what I'll do is I'll click up there on the first step, and this is where I'm going to need to modify things. So what I'll do is this. I'm going to make my rulers visible. because my rulers is one place where if I move my mouse on top of my ruler and I press the right mouse button, which is control clicking if you have only one button on a Mac, I can change my measurement system that's currently being used. And let's see if there's anything in here that might make it more universally applicable. So if I set that to %, then I can hide my rulers. And now I'm going to hit now I'm right at the top, the first step of my action. And I'm going to hit the record button.
There was some glitches going on with yours.
Oh, so it might have problems with the video? No, because we used this machine before.
I think it's the dongle. We're gonna.
We already swapped that once.
Yeah, I think it's
Oh.
getting moved. It should be.
What do you want to do?
Yep.
What are you going to swap it or?
No, I'm gonna give a little strain relief.
Okay. So when I start back up,
Yeah, do you want to take a step back? Is that
I just got to remember what the heck I was doing. I'll do it from when I show my rulers. I'll show my rulers, change the measurement system, and then turn them back off, and therefore they can find that.
Did you guys hear that?
So this used, what was this at? Inches, wasn't it?
Cool. That should be good. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Taking one step back to measurement.
What's that?
Rulers is good.
Okay, rulers.
All right. You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, so now let's show our rulers, because our rulers is one place where we can choose what measurement system Photoshop is using for our images. And if you go to the ruler with your mouse and you press the right mouse button, which is, if you're on a Mac, the same as control clicking. You hold down the control key and click your mouse if you only have one mouse button. And if you look within this list, do you see anything that might help us? Well, all the choices in here would mess us up except for that one, percentages. I'll set it to %, then I'll turn my rulers back off because I didn't really need to see them. I just needed to change that setting. You can also change it in your preferences if you were to go in there. And then I've clicked on the step I want to replace. I'm going to hit the record button to say record starting right here, not at the end of my action. If the last step in my action was selected, it would start right after that. But since I've clicked right here, I hope when I hit record that it's going to start recording right there. Then I'm going to use my marquee tool, and it doesn't matter which corner of your screen you start at. I'll start in the lower right just because I can more easily see it. And then I'll drag up like this and let go. Then right afterwards, I'll hit the stop button because we only wanted to record one step. And now let's inspect how that step was recorded to see if it will help us. Yeah, that's going to do it, isn't it? Because now even if I have a 30-inch wide image, it can still make a selection where the top is 10% of the way down the image and where the bottom edge is 90% of the way down, and so on. So that's a much better thing. So now I'll take this top setting and I'll drag it down here to the trash can to get rid of it. Okay? The other thing I could have done if I happen to not want to get rid of it is the checkboxes over here. It means should that step be ignored or not. And if you turn off any of the checkboxes, the checkbox next to the action's name turns red to indicate, to warn you, to say not all the steps are going to be applied. That's the only thing that means. But why keep that step in there? Because then a month later, I'll come in here and go, well, what's that for? Why is that turned off? You know, and I won't remember why. All right, so it's set the selection, and now we got that to be compatible with other images. Let's look at our other steps just to see if there's any other clues. Select and mask. This is just writing down, if you look, everything's 0 in general except for the feather setting. Now, the problem there is if I have a really small document, one that's 2 inches wide, feathering it 225 pixels, that might be an awful lot for a very small image. And if I have an image that's 60 inches wide, feathering that much compared to the entire image might be a small amount. Does that make sense? So it might be that when this step comes up, I can't set this to %. It's stuck at pixels. There's no other choice. But I do have an option. And that is when this comes up, I could click right here in this little empty spot. And what that means is when I get to this spot, actually show me the screen that was used at that stage. So instead of just using the setting that was there, sure, it'll type in that setting, but I'll be in the select and mask screen so I can move it and change it. So it would be appropriate for my image before I click OK and it continues on with my action. Make sense? That's what that means. And if you ever turn that on, then the name of your action will be up here, and to the left of it, it will show you this, and that means that at least one step within your action is going to ask you for settings. It's going to bring up a screen. And I don't know for certain, but I think the dash in the middle means that not all of the steps. If the dash wasn't there, it would mean every step will ask you. I think that's the case. So we'll do that. Inverse should work fine, because that means select the opposite. Make adjustment layer. That's fine. This is where if I really wanted to use vibrance instead of hue and saturation, I could click on this step, hit record right now, do a vibrance adjustment layer, hit stop, and then throw this away. Just like we did with that other step above. But I'm going to leave that because it's equivalent. Set current adjustment layer. This is just saying what was in the adjustment layer. So this made the adjustment layer, then this made the adjustment within it. And that should be fine. You don't usually have to read everything. If they're set to 0 or normal, you're fine. Then here it says select RGB channel without make visible. I actually am not certain what that was. What did I do right after I did my adjustment layer? I think what I might have done is like click on the layer or something. I actually don't recall. And down here it says current. Oh, what I did is I double clicked on the layer. And when I double clicked on the layer is when I changed its name, and it says current layer, name, desaturate. So it changed the name of the layer. So I think this was my very first click. When I clicked over here, it just happened to record that as a step. So I think we're OK. Now, it's best to test it. If you weren't sure, then what I would do is first revert this image back to its original. If you go to the File menu and choose Revert, you're going to get the version of the picture that's been saved on the hard drive, like the original. And let's just apply our action. I'll come over here, click on the name of our action, hit play. See how it brought up, asked me for the settings? So if I had a 30-inch wide image, this would probably look like a small amount of feathering compared to the entirety of the image. And I could come over here and change it. It's actually just nice being able to choose it at the time that you're doing it, because each image might need something slightly different. Click OK, and it just continues on with the action and finishes it. If it ever says your scratch disk is almost full, just so you know, there's two different wordings you'll find. One is your operating system telling you your hard disk is almost full. The other one is Photoshop complaining and saying your scratch disk is full. Similar messages, similar meanings. Photoshop, when it needs extra memory, more memory than is what is installed in your computer, which will usually happen when you have a really complex document with lots of layers, it's going to use part of your hard drive as a substitute for real memory that it wishes was installed in your computer. And when it does that, it calls your hard drive the scratch disk. And when you quit Photoshop, that area of your hard drive it was using as a substitute for real kind of memory gets freed up again when you quit Photoshop. But if your hard drive completely fills, Photoshop can't write to that file anymore, and that's when it says your scratch disk is full. Okay? So now, can you tell that the edge of my photograph is less colorful than the center? I can see up here where the sky is, it looks a little bit more grayish. So it did work. If I turn off this adjustment layer before and after, so we have another successful action. So we're starting to learn a little bit that you can make an action that doesn't work for every picture, because if you don't think through it in depth and kind of look at each step to make sure it works, it can mess things up. So let's see how else we can mess things up. I don't know if you recall or not, but I had this image open a while ago in our series of lessons. And when I had it open, I ended up using a technique where we separated the detail from the color. And it was a technique where I really don't want to remember the steps to it, because I don't enjoy the steps at all. And so I would much rather record it as an action. So let's do it. Create a brand new action, same way we did before. Remember this icon right there. This time I'm going to call it detail from color, whatever. Click record. Now it's paying attention to what I do. Now you notice I didn't practice ahead of time? I should have practiced. Every time before I record an action, I practice, because if you mess up in the middle of the action, the undo command's not recorded, so you've got to stop, delete things, and it's harder to think about. But we'll see if I can remember how to do it. Okay? What I ended up doing is I duplicated the layer. And if I want to keep, sometimes I like keeping the original underneath. So I have the part that separates the detail from the color, and then I have the original. Just sometimes I like that. So if that's the case, when I duplicate this layer, I actually want 2 duplicates for a total of 3 showing up there. So I'm going to type Command J twice. Then I'm going to double click on the top layer, and I'm going to call it Detail. I'm going to then double click on the middle layer and call it Color. I'm then going to unlock the background just so I can change its name. And double click. I could have just double clicked because you don't need to do both. And I'm just going to call this Original Image. Okay. The act of double clicking would have unlocked it, so that was an extra step. Then I'm going to click on the layer called Color. And that's the one I'm going to blur. So blur her, Gaussian blur. Now I'm already anticipating, because I know that the amount of blurring would most likely need to be different depending on the picture. If I had a low resolution, tiny picture versus a huge high res picture. And so I'm already anticipating that I'm going to be turning on the little icon, the little square area that says ask me for settings. Click OK. Then I need to click on the top layer, and I'm going to choose Image, Apply Image. In here, I needed to set this to tell it to compare the color layer. I needed to do it in subtract mode. I needed a offset of 128 to end up with 100, to end up with gray, and to make it so it's the right amount, I needed 2. Yes, I actually remembered that junk. I don't want to store that in my head. I really don't want that stored in my head. I'd rather have it stored in the Actions panel. But then I changed this, and I think it was linear light, I hope. To be honest, I don't go through this process manually. I use an action. So there we have it. I finally might want to just turn off the eyeball in the original just so I don't think it's needed for the end result. I'm going to hit stop. Now let's see if there's anything that might mess this up or anything I'd want to modify. Well, I already think of one thing I want to modify, which is the amount of blurring would need to vary depending on the picture. So I look within my action, and I'm looking for the blurring. You see it right there? Gaussian blur. And I can turn on that little icon. It was you just click in this little rectangular, little square area to put it in there, and that means asking for the settings when you get here. Now, it will start with this setting. That will always be in there every time I run the action. And if I find that that number was always, like the first time I recorded the action, the number was way too high. I was working on somebody else's file that it was a mega resolution picture made with a camera that I can't afford. You know, it's an absurd camera. And I used the setting for theirs because the detail was so refined that I needed a high number. And now when I apply it on my images, I have a much lower resolution camera, and that number is always too high. Well, you can do this. If I come in here and double click on that step within my Actions panel, I'm going to double click on Gaussian blur. It will bring up that command. And I can change the setting that I have in there. and click OK, and you'll see the action is updated. But that's only true for steps that actually had windows that came up asking you for settings. If, on the other hand, whatever it is you did didn't have a window come up, then you can't double click on it to change it. Like when I made a selection. I can't double click on that and tell it to be 10% over and 90% on the other side. I'd have to redraw the selection to get it to record. So anyway, I didn't really need 50 in there, so let me double click and get that back down. And when you double click on a step, it's just going to apply that to your picture. So know that now you're just going to have a blurry picture sitting there, meaning that you'll have to choose undo if you didn't really want that on this picture, but you wanted the change in your action. All right, let's look through the rest. Layer via copy, layer via copy. That should work because it's just a straight up thing. Set current layer. Okay, I'm naming the current layer to a choice called detail. That's when the top layer was active. That's the layer that was active at the moment I was done duplicating them. That should work fine. Here, select layer. That's when I clicked on the middle layer and made it active instead of the top one. But look at the way it's recorded. It says select layer, and it has the name of the layer sitting there, layer 1. Well, that layer is only going to be called layer 1 if I don't already have a layer called layer 1 in my document. If I type Command J, and I've already done that in the past, this might be called layer 6 or something else. So that could make it so this particular action is not compatible with every image. Because if there's already a layer called layer 1 and I'm typing Command J on something else, Command J is going to create a new layer with a different name on it. Does that make any sense? So I have to think about, is there a way I could replace that step with something else that is more universal? So I think back to what was I doing at the time? Well, I had just duplicated these layers. I was on the top layer. I had already double-clicked and changed its name to the word detail. That's the last step that's in here. See, detail. And the next thing that I had done is I clicked there and switched the layer. This layer used to be called layer 1. I double-clicked on it and changed its name. Well, somehow I need to figure out how to change layers without clicking, like I am right now with my keyboard. I'm going to replace this step. Here's what I'll do. I'll hit record. First, I'm going to practice. Okay. I'm going to hit record. Then I'm going to hold down the Option key, which is Alt in Windows. And I'm going to press the left bracket key. You know, the square bracket? The left one. There. And then I'm going to hit the stop button to stop recording. And let's see if that's any different. Select backward layer. I don't like the wording. It just means, it should say select underlying layer, you know, but backward sounds weird. It thinks of it as forward or backward, going up or down. So let's see, is there a choice about a backward layer? Let me find out. No, step back or arrange backward, no. You can go to the help menu to search for commands in your menu commands. So if you're not sure, let's see if there's one called select. I don't see it. But I just know if it is a keyboard shortcut. There's a chance it only works as a keyboard shortcut. It's the same keyboard shortcut I used earlier when, in a different session, when I showed you how to do a slideshow within Photoshop. And we ended up needing a stack of layers, and we had one layer active and only that layer visible. And I used those same keyboard shortcuts to cycle the layers and have a slideshow. Well, if you make a lot of actions, it's a keyboard shortcut you might want to have written down somewhere. And that is to hold down the Option key and use the brackets to go to select the layer above or below. And so now I'm going to drag that one called layer 1 to the trash. So now that should make it more universally compatible. Because if I type Command J twice, I have 2 new duplicates. And it says select backward layer. That means the one underneath. It doesn't matter what it's called. So it'll work regardless. All right, then set current layer. We change the name to color. Then here it says set background. Set background. Well, what if I'm not working on a layer called background? What if when I clicked, because what I was doing next is I came down here to the layer below, which used to be called background. I changed its name to original image, and I turned off its eyeball. Well, here it says select the background layer. What if I'm working in a file that simply has no background and I decide to apply this action? Well, it's going to complain when it hits this. It'll say, can't do that, can't find the background layer. So all I was trying to do is right before that, I was on the middle layer. I called that layer detail. And I just wanted to grab the layer directly below. So don't I just need to have the exact same thing as what we had right here where it says select background layer, or backward? So what I can do here is just, if I want to, I could record that separately, or I can grab this step and drag it. If you drag it like this, you could move it down there and change the order of the steps. And if you hold down the Option key, you'll drag a copy. So it's, might as well do that. And then I'll just throw away the other step. Now it says it's going to set the current layer to the name called original image. And as long as it says current layer and not background image or the name, the previous name of the layer, that'll work. And then here now we're saying select the layer called color. That's fine, because the layer called color was created during this action and was named that specifically by this action, so that I know there's going to be a layer called color every time this action is applied, because that's one of the previous steps. Got to be careful with what you name some of them, though, if they're common names for layers. Because if you're working on a complex document, when you decide to apply this action, there might be another layer with that name already. So just be careful with what you name them. You know, think through it a tiny bit. Okay, then we got Gaussian blur. We already got it, so it's going to ask us for the settings. Down here it says select the layer called detail. That layer was created during this action and named during this action, so we know it's going to exist. So that's okay. Apply image. And here it says we're going to use the layer called color, which we named within this action, so we know it's going to exist. It's not like it's saying background or something else that might not exist. Using subtract, that should all work. Set that current layer to linear light. That's going to set the top layer to linear light. Then this says hide a layer that's called original image. And as long as that layer was named as part of this action, we know it will be called that when the action's being applied. So I think we got this to be compatible with other images. Right? But you see how it's useful to think through it? And it makes it so actions aren't for everybody, because you need to be the kind of person that's dedicated enough to invest this time in order to automate that. And that's why I include a bunch of actions with this class if you purchase it, is if you are not the kind of person that feels like going through all this technical stuff and thinking through every little instance of how this might mess something up, I'll do it for you. And you get the actions with the class. Right? So this is one of the actions that you get with the class. So let's just test it. I'm going to revert this image back to the original. I'm going to click on the name of our action, and I'm going to hit play. It's bringing up the blur dialog. Remember, we had to blur it to get away with the detail. I'll click OK. It continues. And yeah, it looks like it worked. We have our detail layer. You can see that it's just the detail. It's in linear light. We've got the color there. Original image turned off. Great. But if I give this action to a friend, and I can do that. I can save my actions by going to the side menu over here, and there's a choice called Save Actions. The only thing is you can't save an individual action. You have to save an entire folder. So just click on the name of the folder, then this won't be grayed out. But if I'm going to send that to a friend, they might not know what to do when it asks you to blur. So wouldn't it be nice if we could put some instructions in? Let's do that. Let's think about where would I want the instructions to show up. I want them to show up right before the step called Gaussian blur, so right after that. Well, let's go to the side menu of the Actions panel, and we got a bunch of things in there, one of which is called Insert Stop. If I choose Insert Stop, I don't know why it's not called Insert Message, or because that's what you do. I can say, and then down here there's a choice called Allow Continue. Most of the time you'll have that turned on, so the moment they click OK in the blur dialog box, the action just keeps going. But if what you needed them to do was a multi-step process, then you end up having that turned off. Let's say what you needed to do is have them open a picture of a texture and resize it to a certain size. And then you could continue this action. So then you'd have allow continue turned off. And in the message, you would say, open the texture you want to apply. When you're done, and then scale it down to this size or whatever. Then what they would do is hit the play button at the bottom of the actions panel when they're done doing that multi-step process. But allow continue, if it's just one step, will allow it to automatically continue afterwards. All right, so let's test our action again. Let's go here and revert. I'll click the name of the action. And just so you know, when I did that insert stop, I made sure I had already clicked on whatever step is the last step that should happen before the message shows up. I made sure I was at the right point in my action. I'm going to hit play. See how it's telling me exactly what's going on. And if this was a multi-step process, I could hit stop, go do that multi-step process, and then hit play again to continue the action. But I'm just going to hit continue. This comes up so I can adjust my setting to whatever I'd like. I click OK, and the action just continues. That's really convenient, isn't it? And that's why when you purchase the glass and you got some actions and you hit play, on occasion, it pops up and asks you to do certain things. But now what if somebody else gave you this action and you ended up using it 20 times a day? Would you really want it to tell you what to do all 20 times? You'd be like, no, I know what to do. I use this thing all the time. So that's one instance when you would either click on the word stop and drag it to the trash to get rid of that step, or just in case you want to give this action to a friend in the future, why not just turn off the checkbox? Or let me see if I can just do this. I might be able to just turn that off, and that might make it skip it. Because if I turn off the checkbox, this turns red up here. Not that it matters, but it would warn me that one of the steps is being skipped. But anyway, that would say skip this step. So I could do that, and if I know I'm going to give this action to a friend in the future, I'd just come in here and turn that back on right before I save it out and give it to them. All right, so we got 3 actions so far. Takes a bit of time, though, to work through actions, doesn't it? Now, we need to think about other ways that things can get messed up and also other ways to automate things beyond actions. One thing that can be useful is with default settings, I think Photoshop remembers 20 steps that you do. What if your action's really complicated and it does more than 20 steps? I have many of them that do more than 20 steps. Sometimes it's just applying a filter over and over in different ways. Like there's a filter, for instance. Here, I'll make an action. I'm going to call this tone contour. I don't know if I'll spell anything right, because whenever I'm in front of a group, my spelling and math skills go to 0, just so you know. And it's really kind of weird, because they're not usually that bad. I'm recording an action right here. What I'm going to do, and in fact, I forgot to set this image up. Do you see we still have our old layers? I wanted to act as if we started from the beginning. So this is one of those instances where I'd hit stop and say, oops, I forgot to do this before I got started. Then I'd hit record to say, OK, start paying attention again. So I'm just doing that. With this action, what I want to do is type Command J, and then I'm going to run a filter that is called, if I can find it, it's called Trace Contour. And I use it so, I don't use it very often, so it's one of those things you'd have to search for to find. That's when on a Mac. I don't know if this works on Windows, because I think it's built into the Mac. Under the Help menu, there's a choice called Search, and I'm going to type in Trace and say, where is it? Oh, there it is. It'll tell me. That's really convenient, especially with filters. But I think that's a Mac-specific thing for that. But I'm going to do Filter, Stylize, Trace Contour. What Trace Contour does is it traces the edge of a particular brightness level, where, let's say it's going to trace around the edge of everything that's 20% gray, or 30% gray, or something else. But anyway, I'm going to do this, click OK. Then I'm going to go back to the original image, but I'm going to do it by getting the layer underneath, not by clicking on the name. And then I'm going to duplicate it again, and I'm going to apply the filter. And I'm just going to do this a few times, but oftentimes I will do this more like 40 times. And what I can end up with is, do you know what a topo map looks like? A map that describes the 3D quality of land? I can get something that looks similar to that, but for brightness levels, where it's like putting circles around all the various brightness levels across my picture. What I do need to do in the end, though, is change the blending mode of each one of these to multiply. And I should have done the first one, but I'll fix that later. And I'm just going to do this process over again. I'll grab the layer that's underneath, type Command-J, and apply that filter again. This is not something that I would ever want to do like I am right now, where it's a manual process. And then I'll set the blending mode to multiply. I'll select the layer that's underneath again using my keyboard, type Command-J, and I will do it one more time. And then I'll set it to multiply. Now, when I created this action, I went through a bunch of steps. And I actually messed up at one point, and that is the topmost layer should be in multiply mode, and it's not. So I'm going to first stop my action and look at here and see how I can fix my mistake. Well, here is a step called set current layer to multiply. So that's the step I wish I would have done when the first layer was done, the very first time. So I looked through at the beginning, we copied it, we ran trace contour, and right there I wish I would have set it to multiply mode. So what do? I take this step, I hold Option to move a copy, and I drag it right up there. All right? And so if that were to actually happen while I was recording this, this would have been set to multiply. And here would be my end result. It looks kind of weird, doesn't it? Now, do you notice that when it traced around the contours of the various brightness levels within this image, it's found all the detail that was in there. So you see how detailed that is? And do you know how with a topo map of land, isn't it usually pretty darn smooth? But if it was real, really accurate, it would be complicated. They smooth it out, so it's really smooth to begin with. So what I think I want to do is modify this action, because here I went through it, but I'm thinking I want a better looking end result. So let's see if I can figure out how. I'm going to click on the bottom layer, and I'm going to put a new step at the beginning of my action. That new step is going to be applying a filter that smooths things out. I'll choose Filter. Let's see, I want to find one called Median, right there. I could just use Gaussian blur as well. But median will smooth things out. I'll do that. That's what I'm thinking of using. Now I'm going to choose undo because I wasn't recording. I'll hit the record button. I'll choose filter, noise, median. Click OK. I'll hit the stop button. And I want that to be happening at near the beginning of my action. So I drag it to the top. Now, the only problem with that is it's going to give me a smoother end result. Let's find out. I'll choose Revert. And we'll play this action back. Hopefully I'm right. And do you see how the contours are smoother? They're not all detailed. But the problem is my picture is all blurry. I wish I would have done that to a duplicate, and when I was all done, it would turn off the duplicate. I didn't. So I'm like, how can I modify my action? So do you see why you want to practice ahead of time? Because this is not the time to experiment. The time to experiment is when you're practicing. And make it so if every single time you practice, it seems like you're always going in a slightly different direction. Keep practicing it until you have a consistent flow and you've made sure that that's the way to get to your end result. Because now for me to get what I want, it's really a pain. So I'm going to revert and I'm going to try to fix this. Let's see, what would I do? Well, I'm going to come in here and hit record. What I would have done if I wanted a sharp image is I would have typed in Command-J to duplicate the layer. And that's the one I would have had it apply the median to. Therefore, the original would still be there. For now, I'm going to switch to the layer that's below and change its name to say the original unblurred image. Some unique name that won't be otherwise in a document. Then I'm going to use my keyboard to switch back to the layer above. Okay, I just had to do all that junk to fix this. And I still need to move the median so it happens right after that. Do you see how this is a pain in the butt? And I doubt anybody's following exactly what I'm doing because your mind is not completely where mine was. So this is why you really need to practice before you ever record an action. Get it down where you got every step down, where every time you could do it consistently. Then go for making an action. And when you make the action, I usually would have the actions panel open, and I would just glance over anytime I did something important to make sure the step I was expecting shows up. Now let's see if that worked. The one step I didn't do is at the very, very end, turning off the blurred layer, but let's find out. I'll hit play. So we got it, and you notice that we have our blurry picture, but I have the original unblurred image over here. So all I need to do is throw that layer away, and we'd be good. So at the very end of my action, I'll hit record. I'll choose the layer below, and I will delete it. One last test. Hit play. Now I just have the original image underneath, not the blurred one because it's part of my action. And now I have all those lines. And the only thing I might do is make it so that the lines are black and white instead of color, but they're kind of fun color. And if I had more steps in my action, meaning I applied the filter more times, I would also have lines in here and in here. But that's a process where I would never enjoy doing the process manually. There's a lot of steps to do it, where you have to duplicate the layer, you have to run it, the filter, and do that over and over again. This is the kind of process I go through when I need to participate in something that doesn't give me my full engagement. I'm listening to an audiobook, or I don't know if an audiobook's quite the right example. If it's because there you do have somewhat pay attention. I'm watching television with family and they decide to put on that show that I'm like, whatever, I'll sit and watch, but I'm not really engaged in. I'm messing with this and watching the TV a little bit, messing with this, watching the TV. And it makes it much easier to deal with this because I have a mental distraction to make it so it doesn't overwhelm me at any point. But when I'm done, I have an action that makes this process so now I can apply it without thinking, which is really nice. So, but the reason why I chose to make this action is I chose to do something that had a good number of steps. To give you an example, and the problem with making an action like this is Photoshop remembers a total of, I think the default is 20 steps that it does. So if you use the keyboard shortcut that I used earlier to get multiple undos, you can go back 20 steps. What if this action has 25 steps? That means that if you accidentally click on the wrong action and hit play, and it has more than 20 steps, you can't get back beyond that without going to the File menu and choosing Revert. What that means is if I hadn't saved my document yet, and I've been doing stuff to it, and I'm like, oh, I just need to apply an action, no big deal. I click on that action, I hit play, and suddenly it does 25 steps, and suddenly I can't get to what it looked like right before the action. I wish I would have just saved my document before that, but I hadn't. I have other steps, and I cannot undo that action. That would not be a nice thing, would it? So what I can do in my actions is when I get one that has a lot of steps like this one does, is at the very beginning of that action, what I would do, and we can add it right now, is I would go to the window menu and I would choose History. History usually lists all the steps you've done to your image. And it, I believe by default, remembers 20 steps. You can change how many steps it remembers in your preferences. I think it might be in the category called Performance, or at least it used to be. They might have moved it by now. And it's called History States. So if you want to look for it in your preferences, history states means how many undos do you get. So what I might want to do here is at the very beginning of my action, I'm going to hit the record button to add something. And at the bottom of my history panel is a little picture of a camera. And clicking that creates what's called a snapshot. A snapshot means remember what my picture looks like right now, so I can get back to it, including all the layers, just like what we have right now. And then I'm going to hit the stop button to stop recording and just make sure that I have that at the very beginning. So that now, if I apply an action, let's revert this, that has that many steps, I hit play, the first step went in there and made a snapshot so that I know that if I need to get back, clicking right here on this word in the history panel, that gets me to what it looked like before the action. And I would do that for any action that has more than 20 steps for sure. And why not do it for other actions that have more than about 5 steps, because that's when you might stop remembering how many steps. I don't know how many steps I need to go back. You don't know if an action has 20 steps or only 2 when you apply it. So it can be nice to create that snapshot at the beginning of a complex action. There's some cool stuff we can do that are mainly for more advanced folks. I want to briefly mention it, but not get too deep because I don't want your head to explode. But actions usually just record what you do so you can play it back. You can now, in the newer versions of Photoshop, more recent ones, have it make some decisions, like investigate your picture and do something if a certain condition is in there. So let's take a look at that. I'm just going to add to the end of this action to do it, so I'll hit the record button. But actually, I don't think I need the record button. I just do it from the side menu. I'll go to the side menu, the Actions panel, and there's a choice called Insert Conditional. That means like insert a question, where the answer sends it in different directions. So if I insert conditional, here is the conditions I can have it look at. Let me see if I can get the whole list on your screen. There we go. So I can have it do something different if the document is a square compared to a rectangle. I can go over here and say if it's in a certain mode, like grayscale mode. Let's say the action makes your picture look orange. Well, if your image is in grayscale mode, it's not going to work, because in grayscale mode you can only have shades of gray. So I might come in here and say if the mode is set to grayscale, then do this, and otherwise continue on with my action. Make sense? Other things, if the document has layers, I could have the first step say flatten image, or say turn into a smart object, or say something else. If the layer is called background, do something, do something different than if it's not, that kind of stuff. But if you were to choose one of these, let's say I'm going to do an action that adds color to an image. Why don't we do that? I'm going to act as if this is a black and white picture, and I'll do that by doing an adjustment called black and white. Click OK. And I want this to look like a wildly vivid sunset image of some sort. I don't know that it's the best image for it, but I just opened it. I'm going to make an action for this. I'm going to call it fake sunset. Hit record. And all this action is going to do is an adjustment layer. The adjustment layer is called gradient map. Gradient map means replace the brightness levels that are in my picture with colors, so that whatever used to be black becomes the shade that's on the left. Whatever used to be white becomes the color on the right. Whatever used to be 50% gray becomes this. And you can click here to go through all these presets. The main problem with it is it can change the brightness of your picture in undesirable ways. So I'm going to change the blending mode over here in my layers panel to a choice called color. So it can't change the brightness of my picture. It can only change the color. And so now I can come in here and try all sorts of things, and the brightness of the image is not changing, if at all possible. Does that make sense? It's in color mode, it can only change the color. And let's just say that's the one I like. You can customize the colors by clicking on this bar, and you can put whatever colors you want in there. So anyway, that's all my action is. Now, first, let's see, did it record every single change I made in there, or did it just record the end result? Good, it only recorded 3 steps, which is make the adjustment layer, change the blending mode of it, and then change the settings for that adjustment layer. That's cool. But now let's see if I can break it. I'll hit the stop button. I'm going to revert my image, and let's say that I opened a picture that really needed it because it was already black and white, and I tried to apply it. It says, hey, it's not available. Stop. What's the set command? Well, you see which step it stopped at? It's highlighted. It says, oh, I can't change a mode to a mode called color when I'm in grayscale mode, because that's what this picture's in. So at the very near the beginning of this, what I could do is go to the side menu and say insert a conditional. There's also some other command. I'd actually have to look for it because it's been so long since I used it. Take me just a moment. I think it might be under scripts. There is a command somewhere which is mainly used for creating actions. Right here, conditional mode change is a thing that you would never use manually by choosing the menu like this, but you would use it in an action. And what conditional mode change does is says if the source mode is grayscale, or one of these other modes that this action might not work in, which would be all those modes it might not work in, then what should it do about it? Well, bring it to RGB mode. That's what this is. This is mainly here for when you're making actions. I could put that at the beginning of my action. And the way I got to it, file, automate. There it is, conditional mode change. So sometimes you need to slip little things like that in there. Otherwise, the other way I could do it is I come over here and say, insert a conditional. And for the conditional, I say if this image is in grayscale, because I know it's not going to work, and I'm probably going to want to apply this to a lot of grayscale images. Then here, though, it needs me to tell it to play another action. These are the names of the actions that are in the same folder as the one that I'm currently working on. And I don't currently have one set up to handle this. I'd have to make one. The only thing that action would contain is me changing the mode of the picture to RGB mode. That's it. And so I would have this set to an action that is converting an image to RGB mode. It says else, meaning if it doesn't meet this criteria, do nothing, which means continue on your action. But it doesn't make sense to put that in as a step in this particular case because of the other menu command I showed you a minute ago. I'd use it instead.
So Ben, if we have this version of Photoshop and we're using recording action with a refined edge, and then we upgrade later, is it going to be compatible with the select mask?
That's an excellent question, because that happens very frequently. Is people create actions using one version of Photoshop, they upgrade, and suddenly Adobe, for some reason, has changed a feature. And so it would be difficult or impossible to record that action again because those features aren't in there. And that's why a lot of the features in Photoshop, like for instance, if you choose image adjustments, brightness and contrast, have a little checkbox like this one called Use Legacy. And the legacy was not as good of a version of this particular feature, but it might be used in actions. And I believe it would automatically use that feature if it noticed an action that tried to use the old version. And so I'm not absolutely certain with this exact feature, the one called Select and Mask, You were asking about Refine Edge, which is the old version of this. But usually Adobe tries to think through that. And oftentimes they make it so your actions don't break when you upgrade. They'll make it so behind the scenes, it might still have the Refine Edge feature hidden in Photoshop, but they hid the menu command. But if an action calls for it, it can still use it. Does that make sense? And so I'm not certain with that particular feature. I'd have to test it. But for a lot of features, there's some code built into Photoshop that no longer needs to be there because you can't get to the feature anymore manually. But just in case you had an action, it would still work because they thought through it. But they don't always think through it. Sometimes they're in a hurry to get the features out, or the person who works on actions never showed up at the meeting that would go, hey, wait a minute, you just took out that feature. You know what that's going to do? And that's why we have so many features in Photoshop that they rarely ever remove, even though they're really outdated, old and crusty features that just don't make sense anymore, because so many people have actions that might need to access them. And so a lot of people will say, please remove this feature, it clutters my menu. And a lot of other people would say, please keep that feature. I have 15 actions that rely on it. And it's been, a year and a half since I've played with actions, so I'll have to get comfortable with them again to figure out how to change the actions to make it compatible with something new. So you'll have to test it. I don't know specifically for Refine Edge versus the newer Select and Mask. But in general, they try to think through that. So there's a lot of actions that you might think would get broken that don't. That's all I can say about that. I wish I had a more definitive answer. So now let's stop making actions and let's just start using actions and see how we can change the way we use them too. Got into the actions panel here, and right now we see it as a list. We see the little folders, and we can expand to look at the steps, collapse. Well, that's real useful when we are creating actions. So we can see what were the steps, and we can modify them and do all that stuff. But once we're completely done making the actions, we don't need to see the steps anymore. So if I go to the side menu of the Actions panel, there's a choice called Button Mode. And that can change the way your actions look, so that now they're just buttons. And so if I wanted to do the same thing here where I separated detail from color, I didn't have to click on the name of an action and then hit play. It was a single click on the button of that name, and now it went through that action. Or if I revert, if I wanted to do that contour kind of effect, I just click on the word Tone Contour. It's not a multi-step process anymore. It's just one click. And this is where you see the colors that can be assigned to your actions when you create them. And if I go back where I get out of button mode, it's just on the side menu, top choice. If you double click on one of your actions, you can change the name, and you can rename your actions, because some of them you'll find the name is too long to fit on the button. So double click to change the name. And when you double click, if you double click not on the name, because that's to change the name, but to the right of the name where it's empty, you get the options for the name. And right there, you can assign a color. And that's the color that'll show up when you're in button mode. So you might have all the actions related to creative effects in red, all the actions related to retouching in yellow, all the actions related to painting in blue, and therefore it'd be easier to quickly look at the actions panel and see how it's kind of sorted. You can also assign a function key. The F key is at the top of your keyboard. So if you apply a action all the time, 30 times a day, assign it to one of your F keys. And also, there are certain things I mentioned that are not recorded in an action. Like, you remember when I zoomed in and zoomed out on a picture? That's not recorded. Well, certain actions, if they resize your pictures, if that's one of the steps in your action, when you're done, it might look like this when it's done, because it resized your picture to something smaller than the original, and that's the end result. Well, what if I want to include in that action a step that all it does is zoom up? Well, what I would have to do is at the end of my action, I go to the side menu, and there's a choice called Insert Menu Item. Insert Menu Item means I'm going to forcibly choose this menu item even though I wouldn't usually record it. So I'm going to just say fit on screen. And then I click OK. And now it just recorded a step that wouldn't usually be recorded. I don't need that step in this action, so I'll throw it away. But we had button mode. Let's look at some other choices that we have. I have my actions made now, and now I have somewhere, well, right here, a folder of a bunch of images I want to apply them to. This could be 1,000 pictures. I'm not going to do it to that many, but here I'm going to select 4 images. I want to apply an action to them. So I'm going to go to the Tools menu, choose Photoshop, and choose Batch. If I choose Batch, this comes up, and up here in the upper left is where you choose which folder your action is in. Remember, we only have 2 folders. And which action you would like. It wants to know where's your source. If you choose folder, you point it to a folder where you go choose the folder. But if you choose Bridge, it means the images you currently have selected in Bridge. Should it include all the subfolders if you had them? Any other little changes? What should it do if it has an error? You know, like where it says, hey, you're in grayscale mode and you're trying to do something that doesn't work. Should it save it to a text file? Because what happens is, what if the second file was in grayscale mode and it messed up an action? You were trying to apply it to 10,000 files, and you left for the weekend hoping it was running all weekend long. And the second image is when it got an error. And you come back and you're like, oh, it didn't do everything. I was going to charge the client for that whole weekend and doing that work. Well, you want to log that to a file, right? Then you'll create a text file and would tell you the name of the file it had an error with and what the error was. So, but we'll stop for errors. Over here, destination. Where do you want it to put the files, or what do you want it to do? If it's set to none, all the files will be open in Photoshop when it's done. Okay? If I choose save and close, it would save and close it right over the original. If I choose folder, though, then I can hit the choose button and choose a folder on my hard drive, and I'll have a separate folder for the after images, and the before images will stay where they were. For me, I'll choose none because it's fine to just have these open in Photoshop. I'm only doing 4 images. And if you tell it to put it in a folder, you can have it rename them. Like just automatically rename them, similar to numbering the files or things, if you'd like to. But I'm going to just tell it to do nothing when you're done. And I'll click OK. Now it's going to open those 4 images. And look, it's already done it. Isn't that cool? And the way I got to that is I was in Bridge. I selected the images that I wanted. I chose Tools, chose Photoshop, and I chose Batch. And that's what I was in. You'll also find a choice for actions if you use something called the image processor. The image processor is designed for scaling your image to a particular size and saving it in a particular file format. So if you had a bunch of files and your client says, I need all those pictures, all 200 of them, as JPEG files, and I want them to fit an HD TV. Well, I choose image processor, and this comes up. And up here it says, where do you want to save it? And down here, what file format? Resize to fit an HD TV is 1920 by 1080. That's the resolution of a TV. So I can do that, and then down here, look at what's at the bottom. What should it do afterwards? Let's run an action. And let's, after it scales them all down, let's have it make it so they're all fake sunset. Now it's going to open every other image. It's going to scale them all down to that particular size. It's going to run that action on them, and it's going to save it as JPEG. So it's somewhat similar to the batch command. The only difference is in the batch command, you'd have to have any image resizing built into your action. Whereas here, I can tell it to do ridiculous things. I can say save as a JPEG at that size and save as a TIFF at full size. Don't resize. At the same time, both. Therefore, I could take the high-res ones and upload them to Dropbox for the client and then take the low-res JPEGs and email them and say, hey, here's what I just uploaded to Dropbox. And in their email, they have all the little low-res things. And on Dropbox, they have high-res TIFFs, that kind of thing. But down here, the main thing I wanted to mention is you can run an action. If you own Lightroom, when you go to the export screen where you can set up an export preset, you have all the settings for what file format and everything else, at the very, very, very bottom is what action do you want to apply. That means when you tell something from Lightroom that you want to export, part of your export preset can be when you're done exporting this, open it in Photoshop, run an action on it. That's pretty cool. Other ways of doing automation are mainly presets. You know, a tool can have a preset, just so you know, if you go to the window menu, there is a choice called tool presets. And you can save the current settings for the tool you're currently using. The Move tool doesn't have any settings, so. And you can save it as a preset in here. You could call that automation. I don't completely call it automation, but it's convenient. There are a couple other areas where you can somewhat speed things up, but the main one is actions. File, automate, create droplet. It's not often I need to use a droplet, but let's see if they work, because they broke it one time. We'll see if it still works. Create droplet. And I will say, this is the batch command. You know, the same one we were in a minute ago? But it's going to be saved as a little file on my hard drive. It does require Photoshop to run, but I'm going to say save droplet in, and I'll say on my desktop, and I'll call this fake sunset, or if you're more sophisticated, faux sunset. I'll hit save, and then I just need to tell it which action, and should it do it to subfolders? If I drag an entire folder that has folders within it, sure, do subfolders. And should it do anything else? Should it stop for errors? I'm going to say no, log it as now. You'd have to tell it where to save the file. I don't. The destination, what should it do when it's done? Careful if you choose save and close. That means literally save and close over the original. That's tough. I'm going to choose this. I'll hit the choose button, and the only thing is if this folder is not there at the time you run the action, I'd have to test to see will it create the folder from scratch. I'm not certain. I'll just say put them on my desktop. Okay? And we could have it rename them if we wanted to. I'm going to hit OK. And before I do that, I might come in here and just have it rename this so that, is there a choice called text? Where I can just type over here, -sunset, meaning that it'll have the document's name adding -sunset. Do you see this right here? Fake sunset. I'm going to go to Bridge. And I'm going to just look at the contents of this in the Finder, meaning I'm not using Photoshop, I'm not using Bridge. They don't need to be running at this exact moment in time. And I'm just going to select these images, and I'm going to drag them to this. And let's see if it works. If it works, Photoshop will be launched, and it will read the action that is stored within there, and then it will apply it. It looks like it's asking me to save them, though, so there's something I've messed up. I'd have to look in that dialog to see why it's asking for me to save them. The most common reason why is because they were JPEG files, and this just added layers to them. And layers can't be saved back into a JPEG, so it's asking me what file format to use. What I should have done in my action is the last step should have been flatten. Then it would still be compatible with JPEG, and when it saves and closes, they'd be there. Right? So now on my desktop, do you see here are those files. So what if you set up a bunch of droplets and you just had them sitting over here on the left side of your screen, and whenever the client says, I want a black and white with that certain tinting you always do, you know, that orangish look or something, you just got a droplet sitting there. And you grab all the files and say, okay, sure, I'll finish them in the next hour and a half. See ya. They leave the room, you drag it on top of the droplet and go on break as it sits there and applies all the actions to it. Right? So you can automate a bunch of stuff in really cool ways. So this has been Actions in Automation. Actions and automation gets some people excited. I see some people in here just going like, yes. And I'm guessing it's going to be about a quarter of the people watching are just going to be like, oh my God, I have a new Photoshop. I can now do so much more. It's ridiculous. You saved me so much time. And then there's going to be at least half that are just like, no way. Because I got to think through all that stuff, and it can easily not work if I get the layer's name in there and all that stuff. And that's when you might do a Google search for free Photoshop actions and see what's out there. Just know that when they're free, usually they haven't been tested as well, so they might not have tested them all different kinds of documents, so they'll break more often, that kind of stuff. So you might need to troubleshoot the actions, that kind of stuff. Or if you purchase the class, you get some actions with it. You get an action sampler pack from me where I put in some useful stuff like the ones we just created.